Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
Hi, my name is Lynn Weber. I'm an alcoholic. Hi. I would like to thank our very distinguished secretary, Mr. C., for asking me to speak. You know, it's really an honor, and it's been great fun working as his assistant. And, you know, people ask me how I got that job, and I don't tell them everything. But one thing I want you to know, it isn't as easy as it looks. You know, one of the things, you know, Evans knows this as my understudy. She knows it, and she has to accept it. But, you know, should there be any violence or attempts at assassination on Robert's life, I have to throw my body in front of him and save him. We've agreed to do this. It's part of what we do. I would like to thank our 10-minute speakers, Steve and Shada, you know, for their fine talks, but I'm a little concerned about Steve. He said he didn't like being honest, but he's our treasurer. Now I know why there's 10 people back there counting with him, you know. And I'm going to fix Kevin now. There. If you are new to Alcoholics Anonymous, I would like to welcome you. I am a member of the Pacific Group and have been for 25 and a half years. And it doesn't seem that long ago that I got here, and yet, you know, I've been here through good and bad times for the past 25 and a half years. You know, my sobriety date is July 2nd, 1971. And I remember so clearly the day I came in. It was a hot day in July, and I was very sick. And I had awakened that morning, and I felt different than I had ever felt in my life. Our book talks about pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization. And I was glad to come to AA and find a reason for how I felt. But when I got here, what I had done that morning, I felt worse than I ever felt in my life, and so confused, and I knew I had to do something about my life or I would have to die. And Alcoholics Anonymous was not something I knew about, but it was something I had heard about, and only by name. I didn't know anybody on the program. I had never heard of meetings. I just knew that there was something called Alcoholics Anonymous. And I remember calling that morning, and the man answered the phone, Serenity Manor. And for those of you that know Serenity Manor, I don't have to explain this, but for those of you that don't, it's a house on the corner of 26th and Broadway in Santa Monica, and there are a lot of meetings held there. And I asked him what Serenity Manor was, and he said it was AA. And I said, "What is that?" And he started explaining it to me, and then he finally asked me to come to a meeting, and I asked him for me the most important question. I said, "How much does it cost?" And he said, "Honey, if you've done what we've done, you've already paid your dues." And I had no clue what he was talking about, and I didn't know what this was all about. I just knew that I said I would be here, and I knew that I had to get here somehow. I called an old boyfriend. The last I had heard from this old boyfriend, now I'm going to deviate into some of my, you know, some of your friends find out you're speaking and they feed you little parts of your story to make sure you say this, this, and this. And I'm going to try and remember all those things, but I know I'm going to forget something, and somebody will be brokenhearted later. And you'll see Robert's lovely assistant turn into a sleaze before your eyes as I go through these things. I had different personalities and different names to go with them, and, you know, there was good reason for this. You know, change of identity is always helpful. But I called an old boyfriend. The last I heard from him, he left a fancy package on my porch. And I had arrived home with my latest true love. And there was this fancy package there, and I was really impressed, and I thought he would be impressed too, know that I was a lady who was well loved. And then I opened up the package, and it was a little embarrassing for a moment. You know, there was a note on the package that says, I hope you can find the love you're looking for, but I can't be it, you know, something like that. And I didn't know what that meant, and I opened it, and it was a case of Colt 45. And I felt bad for a few minutes, and then I popped open one of those cans. Life changes. You know, and I called this guy, and he showed up. And I started looking at him, and I was very sick that morning, and I thought, well, maybe I can get back together with him, and he can take care of me, and everything is going to be all right. But I have to tell you, that's the last time I've ever seen him. And he dropped me off at the corner of 26th and Broadway, and I was stuck there. And it was hot, and I was sick, and I was sitting on the curb, and I was trying to figure out how to get in the meeting. And if you are new to AA, it's very difficult to find out, is this the place? And how do you make it in that door? And what secret codes do you have to know? Very complicated things for people like me. And so I sat there and threw up at the curb for a little while, and you know, finally braved my way in. And as I crossed that small parking lot, you know, and walked up the steps, I was scared to death. And I'm somebody who liked to be cool at all times. And I was very uncool that day. And as I walked up, this guy said, oh, you must be Lynn, our newcomer. And I thought, how do you know? Yeah, how do you know these things? And of course, today I know how he knew. I was dressed, I'm a very fashionable person. And I was dressed in the height of fashion for 1971 for an alcoholic of my type. We find names for everything, justification. But at any rate, I was dolled up. I had long hair, and it was dyed Almonte orange. And it was ratted into this giant beehive with a ponytail hanging down the back. And since I was always somebody that trolled for guys, you know, I always liked to look good, and I had multiple eyelashes on. And I also threw up a lot when I drank, which means that your eyes water and these little things peel up at the corners. You have to carry glue with you, you know, if you want to look good. And, you know, the girls know. And so when I drank, you know, these things would start curling up, and I'd try to catch them before I'd find them on my toe or something. But, you know, I would get there, and I'd lean in, you know, go into a bar or something and, you know, try and get this glue back on the eyelash and push it in. It's always about 1/8 of an inch off. So you fill it in with eyeliner, you know, and my eyes just kept growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And then I wore false eyelashes and, you know, these hair pieces and all this crap, and I had white lipstick, you know, to deck off my outfit. I had on an orange shirt, and I had all this fancy, expensive jewelry that somebody had decorated me with. And some of you remember the jewelry of that day. It was leather, and it was those Indian bells and the psychedelic beads, and, you know, it was all woven together in these fancy leather arrangements. And I had them on my neck and on my wrists and ankles and on my boots, and I was wearing a pair of dirty jeans and boots with motorcycle grease on them. And, you know, I thought I looked good and really cool. And a newcomer, moi, you know, how could this be? They took me into the room, though, and they gave me half a cup of coffee. And the cups of coffee were different then. They were these, the porcelain mugs. And we used to have to wash those after the meeting. It was a great ordeal. But, you know, the first time I got handed a cup of coffee, it was a half a cup. And I don't like half cups of anything. And I asked the man if he was out of coffee. And he said, honey, we never run out of coffee in AA. And I was somewhat impressed with that. I've found out differently since I've been here. You know, it happens sometimes, but, you know, he sat me down, and he says, here's a woman that will tell you about the program. And this dreadful woman named Lorraine started whining about things, and, you know, she was telling me, you know, she was going on and on about this drivel, and I was shaky, and I was scared, and I needed a drink, and I was already panicked by the fact that I had walked into this place. I just had to get out of there now. And so this woman is moaning on and on about this man who had had his way with her and then left her. And I thought, once? You know, God. You know, I couldn't believe it. And so, finally I said, I thought AA was a place that you come for help. And somebody rescued me and started telling me about the program. And I was blessed, without going into a whole long story, I was blessed with all the lower companions of AA when I was new. And they took charge of my life entirely. And, brushing through the first 2 months before I found the Pacific group, one of the things that happened to me, I'd been sober. I was scared. That keeps you sober. If you remember your last drunk, it'll keep you sober for a little while, hopefully long enough to find the joy of our program. But I'd been sober about 2 weeks, and I was determined to prove. I'd heard in a meeting that if you try everything for 90 days and you don't like what you found, AA will refund your misery. And I was miserable, but I wasn't going to tell anybody. And I knew that you had to say yes to every AA request. I knew that. So what happened was that an old timer called me up, and he asked me to go on a 12-step call. And I thought, well, this is great. I know that this is something one is supposed to do, and I'll do this. And this man took me out to dinner, and he read the big book to me and getting me ready for this 12-step call. And then he took me to a hotel room and started taking off his clothes. And I said, what are you doing? And he said, well, you should undress and, get ready. And I said, for what? And he said, well, we have to, you want to learn about this program. And he said, in order to learn about this program, you have to relate to someone on a one-to-one basis. And, this was a significant moment in my life because I am a girl who can't say no. However, that's the first time I said no. And I said to the man, if that's what AA is all about, it's no different than anything else. And the answer is no, and I walked home. And it was a long way, and I was scared, and I was upset about everything, and I thought, this is just a big sham, too. And I didn't know quite what to do about it. But something happened. I had given my number to a few people, and they asked for it. And somebody called me. I was very impressed with that. But I was not somebody who snitched on others, and when they called and wanted to know if I wanted to go to a meeting, I said that I wasn't going back. And they wanted to know why. And I said that I was finished with AA, and they said, have you been drinking? And I said, no, I haven't. I'm just not going back. It's no different than anything else. And then finally they kept pushing me until I told them what happened, and I felt like a traitor for snitching. But then they said, our program has 12 steps. We refer to what happened to you as a 13th step, and there are only 12. And so, since we only have 12, you've done everything right, and we're picking you up for the meeting. And picking me up for the meeting changed my life. I wound up in a meeting that was different. I had been warned very seriously by the people whose meetings I was attending to stay away from Lake Street. It was a terrible place. And there was a man named Clancy who lived on Lake Street. And it was terrible, and the things that we'd have to do here were just, beyond what any woman would do. And I thought, I've done a lot of things, I wonder what they have created, and so there was some intrigue there. The only tough part about it was I had actually gone out a couple times with a guy named Clancy who lived on Lake Street. And so I was a little concerned that this person who I knew might be this person, and I didn't know there were two Clancys on Lake Street. But the funny part is that, in one of my adventures, when I was working my way through college, I worked as a housekeeper at 1212 Lake Street. And so I was kind of upset when they took me there because I didn't know these people had moved out and the new Clancy had moved in. So I thought, why are they taking me there? They want me to clean the house again? What's going on here? And so I got pretty upset about that. I did go to a meeting and something different happened. And participation was different. The people were laughing and they were happy, and the feeling in the room was different. And this was a Clancy meeting, and it struck me during the beginning of the meeting that this was one of the nights I was warned to stay away from 26th and Broadway because Clancy and his people would be there. And I thought, how do I get out of here? I've heard you can't leave a meeting after you're there. You have to stay through the whole thing, but I've got to get away from this. And I was getting scared. And then the last speaker for the 30 minutes of participation was Harvey A. And he said something that really hit home. I can't tell you what it was, but it had enough of an impact on me that I pushed through the crowd and I grabbed Harvey's hand. And Harvey took my hand and put it into the hand of Roz Bell and told her to sponsor this girl. And that was my beginning at the Pacific Group, and I've been here ever since. And it has been the greatest thing that has ever happened to me. It has not asked much, but it's asked all I've had. And I have had to be here, not had to be here, it's your choice. And to me, it has been the smartest thing I have ever done. Alcoholics Anonymous has given me, such a new freedom to enjoy life that I can't believe it ever happened to me. Just backing up a bit, I always forget something, but I was actually born into a family who loved me. And I come from Michigan, and our family is kind of a border family. We had part of our family in Canada and part in Michigan, and we crossed the border all the time. And we moved out here and several times. And my father was an alcoholic. My mother was a practicing Mormon. Before I forget, my father is still sober. And for those of you that know him, he's living in Barstow at retired military housing, and he's doing very well and going to meetings there. And he has been sober 2 years less than me, which counts in this group, I appreciate that. I heard my husband a few minutes ago, and my husband has less time than I do too, and I'll never let him forget that. So it keeps you on your toes. But my family did travel around a lot, as my father was an alcoholic. He was trying new things all the time, and we traveled with him. And we wound up settling in California, and I didn't like it much, and the people were different, and it took a little while to get used to. But when I got used to it, it just seemed to be okay. It was shortly after we arrived that I had gotten beat up and raped by somebody who broke my face for me and broke my arm, and left me, I've had a lot of work done on my face, and you can tell I'm gorgeous, can't you? But for those of you that are going to be studying my face for the rest of the night, you can see that one lip hangs lower, so. At any rate, that was not much fun, and people did not talk about it then. There were not a lot of support groups, and that was something that I just had to live with. There was a long court trial. They caught the guy, and he was one of those serial psychos, and they put him away for a while, and, it was just, you're just supposed to carry on. I was engaged to a man who was, soon reported killed in action in Vietnam, and that seemed like the end of the world. And, I knew all about love. I had found I was somebody who was supposed to be a smart person, and, we lived with relatives a lot, and one time, when I was very young, I had adult reading privileges. We had a small library, though. You go through Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys real fast, but I would read anything that I could find. And I was one time making my aunt's bed, and I found under her bed these wonderful magazines, Modern Romances and True Confessions. And I learned that you can do all kinds of terrible stuff with people, and then Mr. Man will come along and save you from everything. And that's all you have to do is find the right guy. And when my person was killed in Vietnam, I thought that I would never find anybody again, and I thought it was the end of the world, and it just seemed like a lot of things had happened real quickly. I was offered a scholarship to Brigham Young, and I don't know who rejected who first, but what I wanted to do was be a police officer, and I worked very hard at that. And halfway through my training, they discovered that I was not quite tall enough. And I had a problem with that. You see, I believe that I'm 5'8", and it's a major problem for me when somebody thinks I'm not. So we had some words over that, and it just didn't work out. And later on, when I was accepted, they found out that I was then too old. So there is really no justice in the world. But I tried a bunch of things, and I graduated from high school when I was not quite 16. So I was on to the world of wonderful things, and I found the guys that started taking care of me, and they rode motorcycles. And I was going to school to be a cop, and I was riding with the guys on motorcycles, and they flew colors. And I felt safe. I felt warm and secure. And people seemed to be afraid of us, and they seemed to have reactions when we walked into the room or drove into town, and I liked that, because nobody messed with me. And these guys treated me real well. I really had no problem and no complaints. And I had some problems of my own, though. I was a drinker. And I used to watch my father and all of his episodes, and I'd think, if I ever drank like he did, I'd stop drinking. But I remember when I first started drinking, I understood instantly why he drank, because alcohol changed everything for me. And if you're waiting for me to get to a drug portion of my story, it doesn't exist. You know, I'm totally a drinker. And I'm actually quite happy about that. But at any rate, my life was getting a little complicated. I was somebody who had been taught by my father that if I wanted to drink, I could do so. However, I also had to take care of my responsibilities, which meant going to school or going to work and taking care of business. And so I have always done that. I rarely called in sick to work then or now, and it has always been this way. I used to have a lot of trouble getting to work, but I got there. I have learned to do things, you know, as my drinking progressed, I frequently got sick constantly. And I didn't know at that time, at the beginning of this, you know, that if you have a drink in the morning, it would change everything. So I used to carry a brown bag with a plastic bag in it, and I rode the bus to work. And in case I got sick, I could have my little doggy bag there, you know, to take care of business and get to work. And I was just a mess at work. And they were looking at me funny and not knowing what to do with me. And I didn't know what to do either. And I didn't know who to tell about my problems. So my life had started to change, and going through a few things real quickly, one of the things that stands out in my mind is I woke up in a lot of different places with a lot of different people, and that was a constant. And the one occasion that really, there are actually two that really stand out in my mind, I awakened one time and my clothes were gone. I was laying on a mattress and box springs, and it was a tie-dyed bedspread, you know, over these things. That was the era for tie-dyed bedspreads, and in the corner was this milk crate with a ashtray with sand in it and incense burning away, and hanging on the wall was a toilet seat with lid. And I didn't know where my clothes were, and I checked to see if I was still alive and had all of my parts, and I was scared. But if you are as cool as I am, you know that you have to eventually face the world. And so I made a little sarong out of my bedspread and walked over, still trying to draw on the courage to go out into the other room. And I lifted the lid on that toilet seat, and there was this picture of a grotesque individual. And I went into the other room, and I found my clothes, and I got dressed. And I looked out the front window. I was trying to find a sign for something, you know, that would tell me how I got there and what I was doing. And I saw nothing. And I looked out the back door, and I saw a horse drinking out of a trough. And then I found mail that was addressed to occupant in this weird city that I'd never heard of. And I was getting scared. And then a pickup truck pulled up, and it had gun racks on the back window. And this grotesque individual is driving, and I started to panic. And he jumps out of the pickup truck, and he says, "Hi, babe, got you everything you wanted." And I thought, what did I want? These are scary times, you know, but I'm cool, so I can wait it out. And, you know, he starts pulling out these strange groceries. I'm not really interested in groceries, and I don't know what to do. And finally he pulls out Colt 45. And I looked at that, and I knew relief was but a swallow away, you know, and I popped one of those cans open, and I guess we had a wonderful time. You know, I don't know. Another occasion, I woke up to hear all these noises, and it was thousands of little ticky-tock noises and whirring noises and little, you know, blurpy noises. And I didn't know what it was, and I looked up, and there were, make a long story short, I wound up with a clockmaker. Now, I have books every place in my house. I have bookshelves, and I love books. This guy has bookshelves with thousands of clocks every place. And, you know, some of them have those little dancing people, you know, they go around. And it's very hard on your mind when you're coming out of a drunk. And then there were, not counting the clocks, there were all these cats leaping through. And we were up in Mandeville Canyon somewhere. Anyway, those are the kind of things that I got into, and I have awakened in Oakland, Fresno, entertaining the troops at Fort Bliss. You know, it could be anything. You know, I was there. You know, one of the names that I used was Pamela Pendleton, and hey, did you know me? I was classy. You know, my husband says, well, you know, we're talking tonight. He says, you know, that was really a cool name. That was your class name. And I said, yeah, but you've never asked me how I got it. And he says, Pamela's a nice name. And I said, yeah. And he says, so is Pendleton. And I said, yeah, but do you ever think of Camp Pendleton? He said, oh, shame on me. I had to live with all these things. I had Gail Nakamura and Pamela Pendleton and the raccoon, that was because of my eyes, and, all these things. And, life goes on. Things were getting very screwed up. My job didn't like me anymore, and I was racing against the clock. They were trying to figure out what to do with me, and I knew that I had to keep working, and I was going to school, and I was trying to do everything and be all things to all people and find my time to drink, and I knew that things were getting tough. You know these things. And so I did the only thing I knew how to do, and that was I found another job. And I then went into the world of traveling salesmen, most of which were married. They had expense accounts, and I learned all about elk club nights, and I learned about creative writing on expense accounts. And I started selling in the aerospace and industrial and oil field industries, and I learned all kinds of cool things in the oil fields. And I had a great time with that job. And, that's where I was when I got sober. And by the time I got sober, I was a little embarrassed because a lot of people knew me. I'd become, a favorite at my company. And my boss was really impressed because he thought I was really smart, and that's how I was getting these contracts signed. And he didn't know how they were really getting signed. And I was very blessed that I found guys that drank like me. And the men took care of me. And I expected that it would always be that way. But there's a part of me. My mother is a very good person. And she has always loved me and wished me well and taught me good values. And I was not somebody that had, I knew what was right. I just couldn't do it. And that was the tough part, because I couldn't very well go to her and say, I have a problem with drinking. She'd just tell me to stop. And I didn't know how to stop. And I knew that I had to drink. I loved drinking. When I was drinking, I knew that I was 5'8". I knew that I was gorgeous. I didn't have any fear when I was drinking. And drinking made everything possible. And, Alcoholics Anonymous has taught me a great deal, as has my sponsor. My sponsor teaches me more, and every year I learn more things from him. But I heard so much. I was like a sponge when I was new to AA, and I would listen to him. And he was not yet my sponsor, but I listened to every word he said. And he said something, that alcohol is not our problem, living is our problem. And when we stop drinking, we should have no problem, if that was the only thing, but we still have to take care of life. And if we could have stayed drunk all the time, we would have no problem. And I thought he was right. How did he know that? And so I started changing my life a little bit as I came to the Pacific Group. My mother sent Mormon missionaries chasing after me, trying to save me from myself. And, I would appear at occasional functions. My sisters were, homecoming queens and, all of the hoopla associated with the Mormon church. And then there was me, and I was sleazy. And I had no intention of changing. And I didn't know what I was going to do. And they either saw me with cops or they saw me with motorcycle guys. And, there would be all of my little sisters with their little curls and, their prom dresses, and there'd be me. And my mother would just look at me with these strange eyes, and those eyes were, I think, more painful than a lot of things. So I just drank, and I continued to drink. I loved it. My drinking had taken me down the toilet. I was living in a place that I had moved in to die. And I knew that it was a haunted apartment building. My doors opened at night, and I did the thing to keep them closed. I moved furniture in front of the doors. I had 2 doors, and the furniture would be moved in the morning, and the doors would be standing open. And I didn't know whether I had been out or somebody had been in. And sometimes I knew that somebody had been in, because I would start searching for things in the middle of drinking. Do you ever look for something more to drink and you can't find it? And if you start looking around for bottles and cans, you'll finally find that somebody isn't really sincere in their efforts. And it's a great relief to pick up a can, with something in it. And then you take a big sip and get a cigarette butt in your mouth. It happened to me over and over again. And I didn't know what I was going to do. And I knew that I had to go to work. And I would get out of bed. And my bed was a problem because, I was having problems with my drinking. And I was so dizzy that I could not get out of that bed, and I was having to throw up, and so I put a wastebasket beside the bed to throw up in, and then I'd get dizzy and that thing would move, and I'd fall out of bed, and I had to go through with that over and over, and then I would crawl across the floor just trying to get it together one more day, and then hang on to the porcelain altar and just try to keep going another day. It was a day at a time then, and it was survival. Alcoholics Anonymous, though, was the best thing that ever happened to me, although I thought it was the worst. A lot of things have happened in my sobriety, both good and bad. I did not find Prince charming when I was brand new, and I thought that it would happen by the end of my first year, and I would dance down the aisle of Ohio Street, and we would live happily ever after. And I did get married when I was 15 to a guy that I had met several years before I got sober. He rejected me in a bar because he thought I was too sleazy, and I've made him pay for that. Shada was right. Working the program comes in relationships, and you really have to do it in marriage too. And I'm grateful that both of us are on the program, and I'm glad that I have more time than he does. It keeps things entertaining. We've had a lot of good things happen to us in our life, and we've had some bad things happen too. Just skating through some of the stuff real quickly. We had built up a business that was doing pretty well, then the roof fell in, it really did. And, it put us out of business for a long time, and, then we had a fire shortly after that. Other family tragedies occurred, deaths. Then I was diagnosed with cancer, and then they found out that they made a mistake. I really was pregnant, and by the time they were done with me, I was not pregnant anymore, but I didn't have cancer, so, you weigh off these odds. And, we're working through these, and, I found more and more that I was so grateful for my sobriety, and I was so grateful for being alive and having this chance of life, and I was, reaching out to people again, and, I'm so grateful for the people who have loved me through good times and bad times and have helped me keep going when I couldn't go on. I remember one of the nice things that happened to us, my husband had received an award, and we went back to Michigan, the place I'm from, remember, and we were invited to the mayor's party and to the governor's ball as part of this big event. And, the governor and I started chatting away, and we were telling, weird stories and, walking through this big, the big museum and really going on. And then he says, Mrs. Weber, I just heard that you are from Michigan. And I said, yes, I am. And he said, what part? And I told him, and he says, well, that's impossible. That's a ghetto. And I said, well, that's where we wound up, and he says, can you tell me why? And I said, well, alcoholism runs in our family. And he started laughing, and he thought this was all very funny, and he didn't, he says, you have a wonderful sense of humor. And I thought, it really happened, it's, and we talked on and on about this, and I thought, he says, well, what brings you back? And we're talking about this, and I was thinking, I know that I was all decked out in a special gown and special, stuff that, we borrow from people and, do these things and look good. And I thought, we didn't get sober to go to the governor's ball. We didn't get sober for any of these things. But these are all new experiences that happen to you if you allow them to happen. And sobriety has been that for me. It has taught me how to live in a world that I don't understand without drinking. I have learned a great deal through our tragedies. It's not something that I want to continue learning, though. It's just, things are now turning around, and it's been a long, tough road, and, I am so grateful for the people that have loved us on some terrible days. One of the things this year that, some of you don't know this, but I've become a movie star in the last 6 months. And rumor has it that I am going to be up for an award for the Best Supporting Extra next year. You never know, stuff happens. Those are all new experiences, and those don't just happen. And, I was really thrilled with that. And, very, thankful to have the opportunity. It was fun. A lot of fun things have happened, a lot of tough things have happened, and, one of the greatest things that happens is sharing this way of life with you. I am very grateful that this place has been consistent for all these years. When our roof collapsed and I called my sponsor Clancy from the parking lot with all the sirens, arriving and all of the different things happening, it was my 20-year birthday, and I was very upset because my new dress was in the building and it was now smushed in water and broken roof. And I said, well, I'm supposed to take a birthday cake, and, how do I do this? And he said, next week. Take it next week. Your friends will be glad to celebrate with you next week. We have meetings every night, and your birthday will keep. And, I think of that, and I think that these meetings are here every night for us, and, these people are here every night for us. And, this life is good. I was thinking that, of other experiences we've had, with going to meetings in other countries, and I went to a meeting that came to life. It was deep in the jungle of Kuala Lumpur, and it was, way out there, no lights, no anything. I thought they were taking us there to kill us. And I'm running out of time, so I have to speedball it, and so at any rate, we finally get out there, and we finally turn into the jungle, and I know they're going to kill us, and then you see a light bulb swinging in front of this little building that's on stilts, because of the monsoons. And then you go inside there, and there's 4 people, and, they're having a big meeting there, and they're grateful for the speakers to come in. And you think, how do they do it? And then the meeting starts, and it's the same chapter 5, and the same steps, and the same traditions, and all of a sudden there's a knock on the door, and somebody walks in and says, "Is this the place?" And you say, "Yeah, it's a place, come on in." And the meeting really starts, and that meeting took off and put the electricity through the room, and everything was terrific. I would like to thank Robert again for asking me to speak. Alcoholics Anonymous has changed my life, and it has made me live a comfortable life, and it has made me learn how to suit up and show up when I feel good and when I don't feel so good. And, I'm extremely grateful for my sponsor. I'm extremely grateful for the women that I sponsor, because with all of you, I found the freedom that I looked for in the 60s and could never find. And the freedom has come from taking care of my responsibilities, and I've learned that from you. Thank you.
I think we got a great talk going on here. Thanks for watching the channel. Taper Dave here. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with, and it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs, long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst and one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, oop, out, in, up, down. And then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. what that shows up. The gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right, but I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.